I think let's go ahead and get started. Um, all right. So hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. My name's Ali Al-Khatib. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco. I want to thank you all for coming because I am so excited to introduce you all to Jasmine McNealy. Dr. McNealy is a professor of media and technology, a scholar of media and technology at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications in the Department of Telecommunications. I first sort of found out about Dr. McNealy's work through her work on data and advocating for the consideration of the harms of the collection and use of data through an ecological lens rather than the kind of conventional lens of like what is the market value of data for like an individual person, which I thought was kind of an unproductive way to think about the harms and the value and sort of the importance of collecting and using these data. So when she was talking about this like much more all-encompassing holistic view of the way that data can be harmful to society ecologically, like through this lens, it felt somewhat like revelatory for me. And so when I found out that she had more to say about how the ways that society categorizes and organizes and labels not just people but things and experiences and all of this other stuff, and how all of that informs not just like the initial, but like even the perpetuating kind of like continuing oppression of people in algorithmic and computational systems. I really wanted to bring that to the sort of applied data ethics audience, to the HCI audience, to I guess whoever you all are. I'm just so excited to be in sort of like metaphorical conversation, and then literally in 30 or 40 minutes in actual conversation with Dr. McNealy. In talking about this subject. So with that, Dr. McNealy, the floor is yours.
So thank you, and thank you to Ali and Nana and to USF for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I want to share my screen if that's possible, Ali or Nana.
Yeah, sorry about that. You should be able to do that now.
Okay, thank you. All right, so hopefully you can see this. If not, you're just seeing me, but that's not too bad, hopefully. So the name of this talk is Looking Beyond the Prototype, How Supposed to Makes Way for Harm. Of course, as Ali said, my name is Jasmine McNealy. I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak with you all related to data ethics and to be a part of this data ethics speaker series. A little bit about me. I study emerging technology, emerging media, with a view towards influencing law and policy. What I would like to do is perhaps impact policymakers at the legislative level, but also policymakers that are not necessarily in politics, but internal to organizations. That's government organizations, that's corporate organizations, that's nonprofit and civil society organizations as well. I'm particularly interested in data governance and privacy and surveillance. I'd like to emphasize or to study failure and the impacts on marginalized and vulnerable communities. And so that brings me to what I'm talking about today. I've been talking about for a while. But before I begin, I think it'd be remiss of me if I didn't shout out the people whose work has really influenced mine and continues to influence mine. And there's like a long list of folks that I could name. I can't obviously name them all, but people like Ruha Benjamin and Sophia Noble and Meredith Broussard and Stephanie Wynn and Chris Gilliard, of course, Joan Donovan and Rashida Richardson, Chinmay Arun, Andre Brock, Sungan Na, Dragan and Karam, but just a long line of people. And if I didn't name them, it's not because they didn't influence me, it's because we only have so much time related to this. But all of their work is really important, and I'm so glad that they are in this space thinking about the impacts of technology from various points of view. So I want to talk about what my problem is and this idea I've been ruminating on for a long time, continue to ruminate on. So what I have before you is this model that I've been working with respect to what I'm calling an ecological approach to data and data governance. As Ali mentioned earlier, I'm thinking about systems and data systems and what the implications are for how data working in a system, existing in a system, means for harm, and then possible harm reduction or prohibition related to certain kinds of uses, and certainly collection of data. So I start with this micro level, and this is a further description. This is like a set of nesting models based on Brossenbrenner, which is a human development, who was a human development scholar, and his proposal related to an ecological approach to human development. But I start with this, micro part, and this is where data is, or is data. This is where the data resides in the model, and I call data a network representation. Move further out, we're at the meso or meso level, and that are the connections to data, the relationships. If data were a human, and most of the time it is, then these would be the relatives, that network, but also some of these smaller institutions or community places that connect to data, that have implications for data. Move further out, we're at the exo. These are the larger institutions where concentrations of power are. And then, of course, the macro, which is about the environment, the various environments, legal, social, cultural, other kinds of environments. And so I have this model I use related to this idea I have about an ecological approach. And so with this research today, this looking beyond the prototype, I'm working at this meso level, because I want to talk about relationships and how those relationships are used in algorithmic systems to make assumptions, to make predictions, to make inferences, and what that means for possibly harm to various groups of people. So I start with this definition always. It is one of my favorite ways of thinking about algorithms, because algorithms are representation systems. And so because of that, I use Stuart Hall's definition of what a representation system is. And Hall says that a representation system is different ways of organizing, clustering, arranging, and classifying concepts, and of establishing complex relationships between them, or relations between them. So this is 1997, when, this quote anyway, from Stuart Hall, who of course is used a lot in cultural studies, but I think it's important to think about algorithms this way, because it helps us understand what actually is happening without being overly technical. But it's about categorization. It is about grouping, clustering. So categorization, and actually classification, really, and we'll get to that in a second. And what I mean by categorization, obviously putting things that are like or alike together. Glush Code calls them equivalence classes, or sets or groups of things or abstract entities that we treat the same. So dogs, there are a lot of different dogs, and dog is this umbrella category, but we look in there and we see that there's some similar things, but they're not all the same. Of course, categories can be judgment-based. It's about who or what to include and also to exclude. And I think that's really important to think about, because we think about deviance. What does that mean then for the decision that is made about that category or that categorization of that thing? And finally, we look at the different kinds of categories that are possible. So we have, of course, cultural categories, individual categories. We see that a lot on social media, folksonomy, or tagging with specific kinds of hashtags that you want. And then institutional, which enables classification. And I think classification is important because that's what these large-scale algorithms do, is classify. They're based on institutional rules or organizational rules that or that program the algorithm, that tell it basically what kinds of categories to put things, so to speak, in. And those things, those categories have large scale consequences or can have large scale consequences. Let me give you an example that probably some of you are familiar with or have seen over the past year. And it's related to, of course, the pandemic. It's an outcome perhaps of the pandemic or ways that governments and organizations have attempted to provide solutions for how the pandemic has required really important changes to how life and things are done. But before I get to that, I want to talk about this idea, and that's prototype. The title of this talk is called Looking Beyond the Total Prototype. But if you're talking about categorization and classification, you should know that prototypes are basically an image, in a way, of a particular category. It is thought of as the most representative thing of that category. And for a particular person, what looks like a dog could be one thing. It could be a husky. But for another person, what looks most like a dog, or the image that most comes to their mind, would be a Rottweiler. They're both dogs, but they don't look alike. At the same time, individuals can have a specific kind of prototype. For an organization, however, there are rules related to prototype, and that's important to think about as well. Of course, there's also prototype theory, promoted by Eleanor Rosch in the 70s, and basically that certain members of a category are more representative. So in certain words or by certain standards, that certain individuals are more representative of that category. So what that category is pass or fail, if that category is make bail or should not make bail, if that category is light sentence or very harsh sentence, some representatives are more representative by certain standards or in certain minds, so to speak. But this is a gradation of features. So membership into categories under prototype theory is a matter of degree. And there are really no clear boundaries unless set by an organization or an institution. But that doesn't mean that there can't be predictions that are made. So predictions are based on kind of the family resemblance. And that means that some, but not all of the common qualities are there for membership in a category. And that's an interesting thing to think about. So let's look at this really interesting anecdote, not really anecdote, but example that happened over the past year. So in the UK, there's a really important set of examinations that happen, the GCSEs and the A levels. So at 16 and at 18, students in the UK take these exams, and they're weighty. And what I mean by weighty is they have a significant influence on, the future of students, what university or colleges people get into, what kind of training programs or other kinds of vocational programs people get into. Now, of course, because 2020 is the year of, or at least the year it began, the pandemic, COVID-19, A-levels were canceled. Instead, there was designed an algorithm. Two things happened, actually. There was an algorithm designed to assess where, or attempt to predict where students would fall out on the A levels had they taken it, but also teachers in schools were asked to provide their own predictions about where they thought students would end up related to grades. And one of the statements about the algorithm was that it was designed to combat grade inflation. So basically, teachers might be influenced and they might really like those students and they might over predict or inflate the grades for students. And to be this is not my opinion, but this is opinions that were attached to the algorithm, to provide more evidence, to be more legitimate, we'd want an algorithm that would, go against this kind of grade inflation. Well, The outcomes were probably, as you can predict, and you've probably heard about, and that is nearly 36% of student grades were one grade lower than teacher predictions, and another 3% were two grades lower than teacher predictions. So you can imagine the outcry, and there's obviously evidence of the outcry. Here is a couple of examples. One is a story about everything that went wrong with the botched A levels. Another is a picture related to the protest that happened once grades were released, because this had a huge impact. People's admissions to university and specific training programs in colleges were on the line based on the results of these grades. But another significant result of this that was found was that downgrading happened a lot for those who attended state schools. On the other side of that, upgrading happened on average with students at privately funded independent schools. So this means that there was a lot of difference that happened related to grading based on socioeconomics, because a lot more poorer students, or middle class and poorer students, would go to state schools, whereas independent schools would be for the richer, more on average, richer students attended those kinds of schools. So this brings me to what I like to call the supposed tos. So we're looking at prototypes and how students on the A levels were categorized, and not just in A levels, but with several other kinds of algorithms. We'll see in a second how categorization and looking at prototypes and family resemblances have a lot to do with how we imagine who should be where and how things should go. So I call these the supposed tos, and there's three of them. One, what is it supposed to solve? And what are the implications of that? Two, what is it supposed to look like? Or who is it supposed to look like? And what are the implications of that? And then finally, who is supposed to be here? Or actually, I should probably put who's not supposed to be here. And what does that look like as well? And so as we go through these supposed tos, I think it's important to think about what are the ramifications for each of these and possible harms related to each of these. And I'm going to show you instances of the use of algorithmic decision-making, machine learning decisions that have gotten attention over the past couple of years. And I think these are important. Of course, you could argue that, there are other algorithms that are used and they're okay. Well, I'm not sure that train of arguments really works. We don't know if they're okay or not, because many algorithms are not audited. And many times we can't look under the hood. Of course, Frank Pasquale has talked about the black box algorithms, and others have written about black boxes as well. And even if we open them, it's been called like doing neuroscience. Even if they're explained, even if the creators or developers are transparent, the complexity of algorithms may be such that it's really difficult to understand what's happening, what's going on. What we can understand, however, is how and on what algorithms are trained. And so I think that's a really important thing to examine as well. But let's get into the supposed to. So the big question is, what are the problems? What is the algorithm supposed to solve? What is the use of data in this way to make specific decisions supposed to solve? So problem solving is always promoted as a rationale for the use of algorithms. We want to be more efficient. We want to be more effective. We want to take away possible human bias, as was demonstrated as a rationale for the A-levels controversy. Another rationale is also used as a rationale in, of course, the criminal justice system use of algorithms and machine learning tools. Of course, this is the example, you probably know this one, but this is from ProPublica a couple of years ago, and their expose related to the compass machine learning algorithm that's widely used in the criminal justice system currently. And of course, the rationale for the use of compass is to take away the biases that humans have. Of course, we know that we have a criminal justice system that has not been, well, let's not even be diplomatic about it. That is racist and many times sexist and homophobic and various other negative ills. Why? Because humans are a part of the system. And so the rationale for the use of an algorithm to help make decisions related to bail and sentencing is to take out or at least lessen that bias. Of course, the problem is that a system like Compass is trained on data that itself contains these same biases that humans have. And so the question comes to, when we talk about what's supposed to be solved, is, are you actually creating more problems? Are you actually focusing on one problem while ignoring the other problems that pop up with the use of machine learning tools? So just because we get rid of the human side or the human portion of decision making, or lessen that, I should say, not get rid of it. Of course, Compass is supposed to be a tool. Does that solve all the problems with the criminal justice system? No, and actually in this case, in that ProPublica examination or investigation, it was found that the system had similar biases as you would find with humans, and sometimes more, related to who got what kind of sentences based on things like race. Also, of course, there's things like gender that can go into play with these. For those of you who are law nerds, of course, you've probably heard of the challenge to the use of Compass by a person who was convicted of a crime in the Loomis case. And the request to basically, have this case reviewed under constitutional grounds, saying there's this algorithm that was used, but it violates due process. Of course, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected or denied a full review of the case, and so we were left with the Wisconsin Supreme Court case that basically said there's no due process issue with this. At the same time, other scholars have said, basically, well, of course, there is a due process issue, but also because we have no idea really how the system works, we have a problem. We have several problems, particularly when we look at what the investigation with ProPublica found. So the second supposed to is, what is the thing supposed to look like? What is the category supposed to look like? And who is being served by that category or those categories? So another example of a recent example, actually earlier this month, is this story that has come out recently. Of course, there's another pandemic story. Again, we have the use of algorithms to help us solve a problem that has arisen. And that is the claims related to unemployment, of course. California is one of the 21 states that are using a system that uses facial recognition to compare identification to find who are the legitimate claimants for unemployment and who are attempting to commit fraud. In California alone, California reported that it has suspended 1.4 million claims under suspicion of fraud. And 300,000 of those people have been able to verify their identity, but so that leaves 1.1 million people who have around 30 days to somehow verify their identity. But that also means that some legitimate claims are being rejected. And actually, it's been reported in this story, for example, and others, that some legitimate claims are being rejected. And basically, we're finding that some people's ID could not be confirmed using the facial recognition system. So we already know from research from other scholars that, like Timnit Gebru and Joy Buolamwini, also Alex Hanna, that facial recognition systems are more than error prone. They're particularly error prone for people who are darker skinned and not read as male. And so what does this mean when states employ systems like this that are, we know, faulty? Again, we have people who are in dire straits who need assistance, but their claims are being rejected based on a system that cannot adequately recognize them using their state or federal ID. So there's actually stories in this, and please feel free, obviously, to check out this story. I think it's really interesting, but it's just another example of the use of these algorithmic systems that are error prone. But there's a story in here that talks about a woman who uploaded her passport photo, and still the system would not recognize or verify her as having a legitimate claim. These are significant issues for people who need help and need help immediately with things like unemployment with other systems as well. So really the question here, instead of what is it supposed to look like, is what are the outcomes that are happening related to the use of these systems? Obviously, in this case, if 21 states are using it, that's a large number of people. If the state of California alone using a system like this is a huge number of people, but 21 more states, that can have a huge impact on the population of people who are now needing to file unemployment claims and may be rejected. Also, we know that it's difficult for people already to file claims, particularly in states that have automated systems. I'm in Florida right now. We had a website set up and it was terrible. It's still terrible, but people could not file unemployment claims because the website, the server, kept crashing. And this was at the beginning of the pandemic. And you have so many people who needed that assistance who were unable to get it or had to wait a very long time to get it because of automated systems. So this third supposed to is interesting to me because we are again thinking about the human element, and that is who's supposed to be here. Of course, we talked about problem solving. What's the problem? What does this look like? Here, I think it's a really important dive into who is the audience, or who are the important stakeholders, but that leads to the question of who is left out, or I should say, who is disparately impacted by the use of algorithms and the data. Of course, this case, not case necessarily, but this situation you probably are also familiar with. This is from Stat News, but there are other reports related to it. And it says that racial bias skews algorithms widely used to guide care for heart surgery to birth, from heart surgery to birth, a study finds. So basically, there are algorithms that are deployed in the healthcare settings that are supposed to give guidance to doctors about what kinds of treatment to provide for certain kinds of patients. Of course, this is based on data that all kinds of data that identify a person. So because we also, like in criminal justice and like in unemployment and the various other contexts, because we live in a system that has issues based on bias, including racism and sexism and socioeconomic discrimination and various other things, these algorithms were discriminating against people of color, particularly African Americans and other people of color, but also against poor people. And so people were not getting the care that they needed. So this is disparately impacting whole groups of already marginalized people based on, again, that data and the relationships from that data. So the question related to this supposed to is, who is neglected? What is the human impact of the use of these kinds of tools? So I want to turn from, in this little time I have left, we talked about the supposed tos and the harms that are possible. And this, I think this doesn't even scrape anything. There are so many other harms that have happened, that continue to happen with the use of algorithmic or machine learning or decision system technologies, or technologies that are based on the use of historic data, or data just in general, which is historic, right? Because of the environments, the systems that we reside. But what I want to turn to is the possibilities for rethinking how people who work with data, people who have the power to implement or not implement algorithmic systems should probably consider. And those are, instead of the supposed to, the must be's. That means, what are these central considerations that need to be considered, or central considerations that should be investigated, instead of using the same words over again? And that is, number one, who is the prototype? So who are we measuring categorization against, or deviance against? In a system like criminal justice, where we know that people of color are more likely to experience some connection to the criminal justice system in the United States because of racism, then who is the prototype that they're getting measured against? They should not be being measured against historic data, which overrepresents them and places them into categories of deviance, so recidivism, bail jumping, whatever the case may be. But there needs to be a change after a recognition of who the prototype is. There also needs to be continuous evaluation and auditing of these algorithms or decision systems. Whether it's banking or admissions or hiring, people need to know what they are encountering, and organizations and governments must put into place requirements for auditing and transparency, so that third parties can then digest this and offer real, true explanations as to what's happening, what's going wrong, as well as what perhaps is going right with the use of these tools. And finally, I encounter situations where people are saying, we've already started using these algorithms, we can't stop using them. Maybe we could just, try to fix the data. Maybe we can, but just because something is difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And one of those difficult things is to make the decisions to prohibit the continued use of certain kinds of algorithms or certain kinds of machine learning tools. I think we should actually normalize stopping or prohibiting the use of certain tools when harm is central, or actually when harm is alleged, quite frankly. And so an allegation should maybe pause the use of an algorithmic system, and there should be investigation. And if an investigation finds harm, then it should be shut down. So the question beyond that is, what's an acceptable state of harm? What's an acceptable loss? And a loss of life, a loss of opportunities. What's an acceptable long-term impact of the use of an algorithmic system? It should be very low, as in very low. We want as little harm as possible. And to ensure that, we're going to make sure that organizations and corporations know that we can put a stop to the use of these. That, of course, will require legislators to put into place regulations, laws, but we are seeing, at least at the local level, movement, particularly with respect to the use of facial recognition in certain cities and the banning of the use of those tools. There's a lot we can still do at the local level, even at the federal level. At the federal level, it's taken a long time for some kind of movement in this area. But I think when we consider these supposed tos and how they have implications for the use of algorithmic systems, we can look at how relationships between data and then the placing of certain people based on data into categories can have harms that we want to stop and we want to prohibit. And so with that, I will stop running my mouth, and thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really great. So I'll let people go ahead and like start putting questions into the Q&A if they want. But in the meantime, I would love to, I've been writing like notes and just like reflecting on stuff that like really resonates with me, and questions that I have been asked that I think like might be that I would love to hear your thoughts about. Yeah, I mean, like, so one of the things that sort of came to mind was like you talked about like this this example of how like the unemployment claims system like sort of fell apart during as the pandemic was sort of like just like reaching this critical mass, and how it revealed that like the system was designed like to help certain people and like not, it seemed, to help the people who actually needed the help. Like the people who were supposed to benefit were the people who were like employed, who already had resources, who like looked a certain way. And it was like such a revelatory moment, I think, like for a lot of, I mean, like I'll admit, like for a lot of like light-skinned people and specifically like white people, to realize like, oh, right, the system was never designed to work, really. Like it was designed to coerce people and to like sort of achieve that outcome rather than to like be beneficial to society or something. And so like that was just such a salient moment of like, yeah, like what is this supposed to here, and like what do people say it's supposed to do versus what is it demonstrably supposed to do based on how people actually act. And so that was something that I just like I really appreciated. I do have a question though.
Sure.
You mentioned that you operate in the space of like policy recommendations, and so I suspect that I kind of like know what the answer to this question is, but people have asked me like, what's your theory of change? Like, what is the agent of change in your frameworks, Ali? And like, I guess like I kind of like don't have a great sort of singular answer, and maybe there isn't one, but like the sense that I get from you is that like a large part of it is public legislative like governance sort of backed like sort of reform. And I'm just sort of curious, like between like sort of the workers at these companies or the public exercising like sort of collective leverage over a company, or legislative bodies or governments or whatever. Do you have like I guess like, do you have like sort of like a landscape of like who you like, what roles or how you think like different agents or different stakeholders should be like involved in this process of like reforming these technical systems? Or
Yeah, no, I think it's incumbent upon everybody to be involved in this process. I'm particularly interested in how communities themselves are performing the work to protect themselves in various ways related to surveillance tools and algorithmic, tools that are based on data, right? Like, how are people, one, discovering that they're datafied, but then coming up with processes, whether they're personal or communal, for getting around or circumventing these kinds of systems. As far as the policy and legislative, I think those are necessary things. I think they're infrastructure for other things as well. I think there are ways of not legitimizing, but I think there are ways of strengthening communal and community-based processes and organizations. I think legislation can be a way to shift power, and that's the necessary thing, is a shift in power, right? So there are concentrations of power in these larger organizations. Of course, we can say Google, we can say Facebook, we can say, whatever, but there are upstarts like ID Me, which I just talked, that story, ID Me, and the various other upstarts in the facial recognition field, right? And they're small, but they have a concentration of power. Why? Because they have data. So if legislation can help shift power, as in you can't use this data, or move away from the consent model of data, then that's a really good thing, because it assists the other actors working in the space. So community leaders, community organizations, tech workers themselves as well. So I think there's spaces and there are roles for everybody to be involved in.
That's great. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I like that sort of sparked this thought in my head just now that it seems as though a lot of, I mean, like I'm speaking from like the HCI sort of side of things. It seems as though people spend a lot of time thinking about like who are the users or who are the people who are directly targeted by these systems, but they don't necessarily think about like the stakeholders of the systems that are not represented in the system as like users or rows in the data data, and so like I think your answer just seems to really resonate really strongly. Uh, there is a question. Ben Gansky asks, can you talk about alternative frameworks for managing data rights apart from consent?
Yeah. So I'm not sure that people are familiar with last year. Senator Brown out of Ohio, Sherrod Brown, proposed what was called the Data Act. Not that this act is like the best thing, but it moved a whole lot of things forward. Why? Because nowhere in that bill was there any kind of idea about user consent. Why? Because consent is not the best framework for all different kinds of data collection. In fact, many kinds of data collection, consent is not even thought about at all, because it's a collection of data that just emanates from us. Also, many organizations work under a frame of, if it's available online, then we don't have to get permission. So using all your Flickr pics and your, social media postings and those kinds of things. But also the idea of consent is so broadly understood that it goes beyond anything one individual would ever think of. So you consent to use a platform, you don't necessarily consent to all uses of the data by that platform and their commercial partners. So I think a better scheme for than consent is changing business models related to these organizations. And this is what I mean. Obviously, data has value because it can be used for various kinds of predictions and making things. But it also represents a person, or it is representative of a person in many cases. And so, like, the question becomes, could a company use a person just randomly? And usually the answer is no. Or could an organization, could a government use a person randomly, or an organization? The answer is no. So that probably means maybe organizations shouldn't be using data in the ways that they're using the data. And so I think a different framework would be, one, allowing, say, communities to, because of the relational aspects of data, to come up with their own rules about governance of data. Two, and maybe in combination with that, is having legislation that bans certain use of data or data use for particular purposes. I'm still investigating what I think is like the best way to go about this. I'm not sure I've hit on this, but I think one of the things that's really important is rethinking data as some kind of like individual thing versus being networked and related to a lot of other people.
Nana, I think you had a question.
I did. Thank you, Ali. And thank you, Jasmine, so much for your presentation. And even in this moment, I continue to process and reflect on many of the points you made. In my mind right now is that slide you showed around the must-be's and the central considerations that need to be made. So for me, like more troubling is the adoption of the use of automated decision within our public institutions, school systems, criminal justice. And I'm wondering whether there's room for in those considerations, like those institutions interrogating decisions to actually even bring a technological approach to these societal problems, which likely won't go away. Or have we gone too far? Is this technology too ubiquitous?
So, you're absolutely right. We have a lot of social problems that tech only exacerbate. Unfortunately, many of the ways that our policymakers go about things is using technologies to attempt to solve problems, but really they're going after symptoms of problems. So the example of the unemployment verification, the fact that people who want to be employed can't get employed is a societal problem. And the rationale for people who can't, for the various reasons that people can't get employed are social and societal problems too. But instead of going after that, and the rationale for people who may, file for unemployment, they put in a technological system that makes certain things worse, particularly for people who have legitimate claims. Another example of just the use of a technology that exacerbates things is the move towards cashless everything. Right. The move towards cashless everything, which cuts out a wide swath of people who already perhaps are unbanked or can't, use banking systems, or who just have cash and would rather have cash versus using these systems, but that leaves them out when sometimes they've been left out already. So, one of the things I always say is that it's important to think of, or for policymakers, not just to think of, but to actually solve the underlying issues we have first, or at least attempt, because adding a technological system just can amplify it and possibly cause more problems than there were on the front end. I don't think all the time that our policymakers and institutions think about this, because we are attracted to bright and shiny things, and that gets in the way, that clouds our thinking sometimes.
Right. And I think that the ecosystem of federal legislation around emerging technology is very self-regulated in itself. So I think it'll be a while before we see significant progress at that level, but maybe there's hope at the local level or community-based level, like you said.
Yeah, no, I think the local is where it's at.
Thank you.
Great. There are a few other questions. So Roya Pakzad asks, could you please share your insights about new data governance proposals such as data trusts or data commons or data fiduciaries, and about their promises and pitfalls?
Yeah, so I have been checking out what people call data trusts or data cooperatives or data commons, and I think they have possibilities. So for a data trust is basically a way to think about it is an agreement amongst players or actors to allow the use of data for specific purposes. I think what good data trusts or cooperatives require is a lot of planning about governance on the front end. and planning, not just planning, but decisions about goals and values related to that data on the front end. So when the trust is actually running, or the cooperative is actually running and forming, when certain issues come up, and they will come up, about use of data, about use by certain actors of data, about profit and making money related to data, and what does that mean, and is that the purpose? That has to be thought of on the front end. Else, there will be a huge problem, like any other kind of contractual relationship. So the goals and the kind of governance that you're going to have, and the mission of the data trust on the front end, have to be specified and clear, and there has to be consensus amongst the actors related to this. And you kind of have to come up with a governance scheme that suits the kind of data in the data trust. So obviously, you don't have to have the same kind of data trust for health data as you have for other kind of data, even though you could argue that all data is health data, but we don't have to get into that. But so really being specific about the needs of a community or whatever collective is creating the data trust or cooperative, and really hammering on that front end, that governance and mission related things are really important. But I think data trust can be great infrastructure for people reducing harm related, or harms related to data and data extraction.
That's really great. Thanks. I had so many questions about like data fiduciaries and data trusts and stuff. So I feel like that clarified that for me as well. Michelle Shavin asks, says, it occurs to me that as these technical systems roll out ahead of governance and adjudication mechanisms, over time they could actually foreclose the space to reimagine how our social safety net should work. But in parallel, the rush to digitize and datafy might newly expose underlying systems dynamics that could wake people up to the need for serious systems change. How might we think about whether this push for automation also opens up space for fundamental rethinking or reimagining, or whether it can be co-opted as a space for reimagining?
That's a great question. So I think the push for automation is an issue. And I'm sure the folks who are library or information science folks will have a lot in parallel to talk about digitization of works and whether or not that should happen, and the push for digitization. So in the case of automation, I think that the clear question is whether everything needs to be automated. Do we need to have automated systems for everything? Of course, we like efficiency, we like effectiveness. The question is whether or not the automation actually adds value to the system that you're attempting to automate. Also, always thinking about the impact on people and on communities. There have been quite a few studies related to what people think about automation, and particularly as it relates to jobs and those kinds of things, and their fears and their trust or distrust related to automation. And the question always becomes like, what kinds of jobs will be lost to automation? And who will be most impacted? Again, this is I'm not trying to make the case for certain kind of jobs being saved, but I am making the case for like, sometimes we don't need automation. We don't necessarily need to create systems that harm people in specific ways. This is something that I have no specific answer for, but I think it's something that has to be considered by all the players. And that is, just because something could possibly be more efficient, do we actually need it? Further, Madeline Ellish, in her work on the human in the loop, talks about, even if we have automated systems or supposedly automated systems, we always need humans there. So it's kind of like the fallacy of automation, because these systems are not always working without or with autonomy, but there has to be somebody always there. And so again, the question is, do we need it then if some human supervisor has to always be there. So I know that probably didn't answer your question, Michelle, but I think this is what I've been thinking about related to this.
I'll ask one last question, and it's from an anonymous attendee who says that they have a question about the prohibition and the threshold of harm. Some states haven't allowed the use of compass, they think, and outside of the United States, different countries have different laws around tech, like the GDPR, which is stricter than what America has. What do governments find to be important when regulating algorithms, and do different governments value different things, or should they?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the answer to the question, do different governments value different things, is yes. If we look at privacy as analogous and actually connected to this idea, we know that in the European Union, there is a different ethos regarding privacy. Privacy is a human right. It's a kind of a moral right, whereas in the United States, we only kind of recognize it as being, okay, something we should remedy if someone has their privacy invaded. And it took us a long time to recognize privacy in the United States. So there are completely different ethos related to certain kinds of ills or uses of technology. And so there's different ways. And so I've just talked about the United States versus the EU, and I haven't even gotten into the various countries in Africa, various countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and of course, Asia. So there culturally, different countries are going to care about things differently because of culture matters in law and in regulation. There are some unifying principles, but each country can decide for themselves how to best protect people, and that'll be based in their ideas related to law and policy.
That's that's really great. On that note, I realize that we're over time, and so I want to thank everybody for coming and attending. I want to thank Dr. McNealy for coming and giving this talk and answering all of these questions. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for this. So everybody, thank you so much for everything. Have a great weekend, and
you.
goodbye for now.